The Western world is in dire need of chemotherapy, for it has a cancer known as individualism. This is potentially one of, if not the most important series that I will ever make, as I firmly believe that if someone understands the concepts that I'm about to show, then they'll be aware of almost everything they need to know about the state of modern Western society today. I suppose fundamentally it all begins with a very simple question. What do you want from life? In all likelihood, most people probably want a job that gives them some purpose, but also from which they can be paid money, whereby with that money they can buy a house in a nice neighbourhood, whereby them, their partner and children can all live happily ever after. And I say this as these basic desires have been universally held by humans for millennia. And yet, if we look at the state of modern Western society today, one realises that it has actually never been harder to obtain such. Most people today certainly don't get meaning from their jobs, working for soulless giant megacorporations within whose ranks they are just a mere name tag, and they don't exactly pay well anymore either. If you're a young person trying to get on the property ladder today, well, fat chance, as unless you're in good with the bank of mum and dad, you may as well just forget about it. And as for starting a family, well, good luck, as men and women have never been more hostile to each other at any other time in human history than today. And navigating through the sea of woman-hating incels and man-hating feminists without becoming one yourself is going to be quite the burden. The point being that there's clearly something very wrong with modern Western society when, despite being so advanced in some ways, such as technologically, when it comes to the bare-bones basics of what human beings actually crave, we just completely fall flat. It's almost like we are currently in some sort of psychological dark age, whereby the fact that people never stop talking about the importance of mental health, nothing is actually ever collectively done to address the underlying reasons why we have so many depressive, unfulfilled, and outright distraught people in the modern era. And so what I've done is I've taken these basic desires and analysed why, or perhaps more importantly who, is responsible for making them more difficult to attain. And I've actually come to the conclusion that there are 3 different types of people that I call the 3 frets, who threaten the average person and completely ruin everything for the rest of us. And these 3 frets aren't based on the usual categories of identity that one may expect either. Not gender, race, nationality, sexuality, or even religion. It's more a mindset, 3 mindsets, that subconsciously feed off each other and make modern Western society as a whole much worse. Thus, in this multiple-part series that I call The Enemy Explained, I'll be going through each one of such threats and explaining how each mindset contributes in making life more difficult for the rest of us. And we're going to start with the ultimate root of them all, the first threat known as the bourgeoisie. But we can't talk about the bourgeoisie without first acknowledging the concept's roots in communism. In the past, the world economy worked in a relatively simple way. Almost every town had their own businesses that would independently cater to the needs of their local community. But then came the Industrial Revolution, which brought huge advancements in machinery, making manufacturing and travel much easier. This process would rapidly advance the world economy at a pace never before seen, but would also completely transform where and how people worked. Starting the process of urbanization, whereby people would start to move away from the rural countryside to cities instead, and would, rather than be self-employed, start to more commonly work for other people. It really can't be understated just how massive the Industrial Revolution actually was. As after the fact, the world would become incredibly aristocratic, whereby wealth started to become seriously centralised in the hands of a few, aka those who owned such newfound industrialised factories. And within such factories, working conditions were often incredibly dire, dangerous and dismal, whereby even children would often be a part of such labour. Not that the living conditions of such workers were much better either. As noted by Friedrich Engels in his book, The Conditions of the Working Class in England, whereby during his trip to the northern English city of Manchester, he wrote, "The extraordinary overcrowding, the bad construction of the labourers' quarters, the absence of gardens and green spaces, which even in the most crowded parts of London still provide a playground for children and a lung for the inhabitants. All this puts the health of the inhabitants in the worst possible condition until it becomes impossible for them to escape the danger of infectious diseases. Now, if you are born rich, the chances are that you die rich, whereas if you are born poor, the chances are that you die poor. This is because there was very little upwards mobility, and everyone knew their supposed place in the world, whether they liked it or not. The exploitation and suffering of the working class in this new capitalist society, where workers were paid low wages, worked long hours in dangerous conditions, and had few legal or political rights, would inspire Karl Marx to conjure a framework whereby he stated that society could be split up into two groups of people, that being the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. The proletariat being the workers who sold their labour and thus received a wage for their work, and the bourgeoisie being their bosses who paid said wages. So let's say you had a factory that generates $1,500 in profit every day. The factory employs 10 workers, and each worker gets paid $100 a day, totaling $1,000 per day in wages for every worker. That would mean then that the boss of the factory would be able to pocket that remaining $500 for himself, to do with whatever he so pleased. In this example, the proletariat workers get a mere $100 each, whereas the bourgeoisie boss gets a staggering $500. And this is practically how every business on the planet operates. Whereas the proletariat are simply stuck at the behest of their superiors, the bourgeoisie actually own the means of production, meaning the foundational business, such as a factory, that is required to generate products and thus profits in the first place. Marx saw this exchange as fundamentally exploitative and accused the bourgeoisie of parasitically extracting the surplus value that the proletariat actually create. Ultimately, meaning that there's a clear conflict of interest between these two groups. As whereas the proletariat seek to maximise their wages to receive as much value for their labour as possible, the bourgeoisie on the contrary seek to minimise such wages to keep as much value for themselves. Marx believed that this conflict of interest would ultimately conclude in a revolution, in which the proletariat workers would overthrow their bourgeoisie bosses and replace the already existing capitalist society with a new communist society, whereby the means of production, rather than being owned by a handful of bourgeoisie bosses, were instead collectively owned and controlled by the proletariat workers, ultimately resulting in the elimination of exploitation and creating a more equal, just, and pure society. Unfortunately, it didn't really work out that way, as communism is without any shadow of a doubt the biggest failed experiment that humanity has ever conducted. Inspired by Marx's manifesto, many communist revolutions did actually take place across the world throughout much of the early 20th century, most notably in Russia, whereby the Soviet Union, the first communist state of them all, was founded. Unfortunately, far from being a utopia of equality and prosperity, the amount of people killed under such communist regimes, by their own governments no less, was so astronomical that it even makes the modern-day White House look like a place of saints in comparison. And that's saying something. Practically every nation that has lived under the system has since renounced it, with the last major communist leader of power, Mikhail Gorbachev, truly putting the ideology in its grave, ending his career by featuring in a Pizza Hut ad.
Это Горбачев. За Горбачева!
За Горбачева!
За Горбачева! За Горбачева!
Sometimes nothing brings people together like a nice hot pizza from Pizza Hut.
Even nations that still claim to be communist, such as China, are essentially only so on paper, and are, in reality, practically as capitalist as one could imagine. Hence, why the only people who take the ideology at face value today are brainwashed young Western university students who do so either out of a lack of life experience, a deep misunderstanding of history, or, more commonly, a combination of the two. Overall meaning that communism, far from being taken as a serious political ideology as it was in the 20th century, is now viewed in the 21st century as being at best a historical artifact, or at worst, a meme. So, why did communism fail so badly? I mean, the fact that during the 20th century, communism spoke to the hearts and minds of so many millions of people worldwide in an almost religious-like manner, no less, passively proves that there has to be something about communist ideas that does warrant some merit. Abolition of public property? No thanks, I quite like to own my own abode. A centrally planned economy? No thanks, I quite like to eat more than just mouldy bread. A free red flag for everyone's bedroom? Alright, sign me up. No, I actually think that the biggest merit of communism isn't so much its more outlandish advanced ideals, but as stated earlier, the very basics of the ideology, recognizing the existence of the bourgeoisie. You see, most nations at the time would always glamorize those at the top of the social and economic hierarchy, with the institution of monarchy being perhaps the most blatant example of such. Kind of like how in my nation, that is still to this day literally called the United Kingdom, whereby the anthem of the nation, rather than being about the land or its people, is called God Save the King. The communists despise this worship of bourgeoisie elitism, and instead turn such right on its head, by glamorizing not those at the top of the hierarchy, but those at the bottom, as perhaps best represented by the symbol of communism, the hammer and sickle, which at the time were common tools of the working classes. And this glorification of peasantry can also be found in communist propaganda, whereby the esteemed workers of the world are showcased constantly in a celebratory manner. This is because communists believed that the bourgeoisie class had to be eliminated entirely, and that there was to be no parasitical elites of any kind whatsoever, whereby instead the people working together would reign supreme. Sadly, however, this would prove to be nothing more than a fantasy. As communism's diagnosis of identifying the existence of the bourgeoisie was right, but its prognosis of trying to eliminate the concept entirely was wrong. Because the facts are that every culture on every continent, from Europe to Africa to Asia, America and beyond, has always had a hierarchy of those at the top and those at the bottom, even in the most prehistoric of societies, as hierarchy is really simply a matter of human nature. In fact, even communist regimes, who remember ideologically aimed to eliminate such hierarchies, still went on to ironically have arguably some of the strictest and most elitist of hierarchies in practice, with the only real difference being that rather than being purely wealth-based, it was now power-based, with the Politburo suits at the top and the rest of the peasant plebs at the bottom. As an innately collective species, ranking ourselves is simply in our nature, even if we try not to. And this really is the ultimate reason why communism failed, because it tried to overwrite and thus overrule basic human nature, to create a new type of refined human, the new Soviet man and the new Soviet woman, who were sophisticated, selfless and hard-working, collectively uniting together to foster a fairer society for all. But the uncomfortable truth is that there are some people who love to rule, exploit and lead, and there are others who don't mind being ruled, exploited and following. Hence why capitalism would go on to reign supreme, there would be no grand global revolution, and any and all attempts at implementing communism, as stated earlier, would end in death, destruction and despair. Because ultimately, you can't teach a turtle how to tap dance. However, despite the idealistic failure of communism, it wasn't all for naught, as from the recognition of the existence of the bourgeoisie would spawn the economic socialist movement, which throughout much of the late 20th century would actually go on to help improve the conditions of workers within their nations, such as by introducing the concepts of welfare, unions, universal healthcare, and workers' rights. And, for a while, throughout much of the Western world, we had a nice balance. The natural order of human hierarchy still existed, but workers were still nevertheless treated with some level of decency. Which brings us to today. As today, it seems like we're going right back into the post-industrial era all over again. Wealth is once again being consolidated massively, whereby you have some people who are billionaires and some people who live in tent cities. There is an ever-growing divide between those at the top of society and those at the bottom, as well as a clear decrease in societal trust, whereby almost everyone seems to be absolutely livid. So, what's going on here? Well, the problems all began when wealth stopped being tied to land. After the invention of the nuclear bomb, powerful nation-states, aka those who possessed them, couldn't really go to war with each other anymore, as it would be mad, mutually assured destruction. Because of this, for the most part, an end was put to grandiose hot wars, such as what was seen in World War I and World War II. Henceforth, nation-states, rather than competing against each other, would instead start to cooperate with each other, by intermingling when it came to trade. And this was a big deal, as this meant that whereas in the past, the bourgeoisie of a nation was at least somewhat engaged in a mutually beneficial transaction with their nation's workers, now that marriage of convenience was subsequently divorced, as the bourgeoisie, who now had access to the world at large, now had no reason to remain loyal to their nation. Hence, wealth was no longer tied to land. And this process really became apparent starting in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, with what became known as globalization, whereby suddenly you had things like NAFTA, which shipped a lot of manufacturing jobs away from the United States and Canada into Mexico instead. Because, as wages were typically lower in Mexico, companies knew that the people there could be paid less to do the same job, subsequently destroying the once booming manufacturing industry in large swaths of rural Canada and in places like the Rust Belt in the United States. Scenes that were also seen in Western Europe, whereby resource gathering and manufacturing jobs were almost completely decimated and shipped overseas to nations like China, whereby again people could be paid less, leaving places such as my home of the north of England that heavily relied on such industries to essentially become massively deprived overnight. And likewise in Eastern Europe, whereby with the invention of the European single market that comes hand in hand with freedom of movement, much of their most productive youth would go on to leave their homelands, only to be swallowed up by much larger Western European countries such as Germany, whereby the pay simply couldn't be competed with. Globalization, much like the Industrial Revolution, provided an opportunity for the bourgeoisie to enrich themselves at the cost of the workers of their nations, with all three of these being prime examples of such. Exactly the same conflict of interest that Karl Marx theorized over a century before. The bourgeoisie don't care what the average person in their country wants, as they have a completely different set of priorities. They love shipping working class jobs overseas, despite the unbelievable level of poverty it creates at home, because it makes them more money from exploiting overseas workers. Treason. They love illegal mass migration, despite the additional stress on public services, house price increases, and inevitable clashes that spawn from it, because it makes them more money from undercutting wages at home. Treason. They love chipping away and selling off public healthcare services, not just as they can always afford private, but because it makes them more money by not having to pay for it. Treason. What's this? The Economic Policy Institute says that the US lost 3.2 million jobs to China between 2001 and 2013 alone? Yeah, they don't care. The International Labour Organization says that there are 152 million child labourers globally. They still don't care. UNESCO says that approximately 2,500 languages are at risk of extinction due to globalization. Yeah, they really don't care. To the bourgeoisie, it's all about themselves, and everyone else is merely their pawns. Now, to be clear, it's not that all wealthy people are bad, as, let's face it, everyone wants to be wealthy, really. And again, it's not that hiring people as part of a hierarchical structure is bad, as not everyone is made to be a leader. But what is bad is a group of elites who view their nations not as a family of families, as they should be, but merely a soulless economic zone that they can use and abuse to their heart's content to enrich themselves. The bourgeoisie of our nations have ensured that our flags, anthems, and borders are naught more than historical artifacts. Nations like France, Germany, Sweden, and beyond still have the audacity to call themselves countries when they aren't even in control of their own borders, laws, and currency. No, these are not countries, not anymore anyway. They're soulless economic zones, nothing more than a stock whereby its assets and people therein can be deposited or withdrawn as per appropriate. Depressing. But you'd think then that living in this capitalism on crack dystopia, whereby the world is essentially at the behest of a handful of selfish bourgeoisie elites, that economic left-wing ideas would be incredibly popular amongst the poor. But no, as it's not just wealth that the bourgeoisie hoard, but power. One of the greatest crimes that the bourgeoisie have done is to hijack the left-wing movement. Socialist economics has been intentionally silenced and replaced to accommodate a newfound social ideology in its place, known as progressivism. An ideology that claims to represent the poor and downtrodden, but is actually mostly made up of the bourgeoisie themselves. An ideology that claims to be world-changing and fulfilling, but is actually nothing more than performative drivel. An ideology that claims to unite and bring people together, but actually now intentionally divides and conquers people via means of identity. Now, what it means to be left-wing has fundamentally changed. As whereas in the 20th century, it used to mean looking out for those at the bottom of society, in the 21st century, it now means to merely mock, exploit, and divide them. Hence why most poor people utterly despise the modern-day left wing, and rightfully so, whereas the bourgeoisie ironically embrace it like never before. The bourgeoisie love the soulless, empty virtue signalling of modern-day progressivism, despite the complete and utter disconnect it has for the average person's priorities, not just because of how it makes them feel like the good guys, despite how evil they actually are, but because it ultimately costs them nothing. Fixing the economic mess they've created would dent their bottom line, but talking about identity 24/7, priceless. In fact, profitable, as such can even be used as a means of virtuous marketing. And it's not just economic socialism they've crushed, but social conservatism too, of which is almost always intentionally hushed and instead replaced with economic conservatism instead. Essentially, as I always say in borderline every production I make, the bourgeoisie have used their influence to take control of all mainstream left-wing and right-wing parties, whereby in their place, the ultimate individualistic ideology known as neoliberalism, that being the combination of social progressivism and economic conservatism, reigns supreme, no matter what fictional side actually wins. The average person then is thus stuck, sandwiched between two castrated, useless movements, the so-called left wing, which stands for the bourgeoisie socially, and the so-called right wing, which also stands for the bourgeoisie, though this time economically. But what use is a democracy if no matter who wins, the result is the same regardless? The Western world constantly pats itself on the back for being a supposed beacon of freedom, democracy, and tolerance. Meanwhile, people don't have the freedom in our democracies to vote for any parties that aren't neoliberal in nature, as they aren't tolerated. Ever noticed how popular politicians from both the left and right, who even somewhat deviate from the established mainstream, very rarely, if ever, get near executive power? Yet somehow, cardboard cutout politicians, who no one even likes, always seem to. It's almost as if the only thing that matters is who the bourgeoisie want in power. One must ponder, if the range of acceptable views is now so narrow, then how are we really any different to authoritarian states like China? It's a dictatorship, but you get to vote for your favourite colour every 4 or 5 years? I mean, come on, this is just a complete joke. In fact, you could even play devil's advocate and say that the Chinese system is actually better, if you can believe it. As at least they are honest about being authoritarian, rather than uselessly trying to hide it. And while there is certainly huge amounts of corruption and incompetence, at least the Chinese bourgeoisie at least seems somewhat interested in improving the lives of their people. Probably because, as stated earlier, the Chinese elite chain themselves and their people to their land. I've mentioned this quote before, but I'm going to say it again, as it's worth repeating. Chinese President Xi Jinping once said, and I quote, "Western states are ruled by a clique of cosmopolitan bourgeoisie thieves who have no loyalty to their own." And yeah. To even do business in China as a foreign entity, you are forced to ally with a local firm. Meanwhile, China gladly takes jobs away from our Western nations in tandem because the Chinese government have set up a system that makes themselves stronger while making us weaker, because they know, even at their most premier level, that we are ran by criminals, who, so long as they are enriched, wouldn't mind such an arrangement. Our politicians don't work for me, don't work for you, don't work for us. They work for the bourgeoisie.
And by the way, you may have heard the CEO of Walmart yesterday on the steps we've taken. He said, and I quote, "The combination of private enterprise and government working together has been really successful."
Almost everything that comes out of these husks' mouths is a carefully choreographed fantasy, plucked directly from some bourgeoisie-approved script to placate the desperate masses. But the bourgeoisie don't just harness control of wealth and power, but also fame, and as such, this empty rhetoric is unfortunately often believed. Almost every news station, movie, video game tune, and most individuals of interest are forcibly warped and used as propaganda mouthpieces for the bourgeoisie, creating a one-voice lockstep narrative of which everyone who wishes to be heard must abide. In fact, in some nations, such as my own, laws have even been passed to arrest, fine, or even imprison those who dare dissent against such doctrines. Fame, far from being earned today, is gifted. Gifted for being a loyal puppeteering sycophant who says precisely what the bourgeoisie wish to be heard. Ultimately, if there's one thing I want you to take away from this production, it's this. These global bandits, the Western bourgeoisie, are the source, the root origin of almost every problem that the world faces. Through their monopoly on wealth, power and fame, through their psychotic individual self-interest, they have utterly destroyed their collective nations while also exploiting much of the globe at large. And while this may be obvious to me and those of us with even an atom of collectivistic thinking, you may be surprised to hear, as shocking as it may be, dear viewer, that this isn't well known with the public at large, at least for now. Thus, much like how communism, despite overall being a failure, temporarily tamed the bourgeoisie by inspiring those below them into action, so too must there be a collective to do the same in the modern era. And from such a collective, the current bourgeoisie must thus be utterly demonized, untrusted, and shamed. Their crimes against humanity exposed for all the world to see, whereby they will thus be inevitably replaced with a new, collectivistically minded bourgeoisie, who, rather than individualistically using others to enrich themselves, will instead collectivistically aim to enrich all those under them as well. A process that, I might add, is simply inevitable. It is not a matter of if, it is a matter of when. But what I've talked about here today is really just the tip of the iceberg. For it isn't enough to simply acknowledge the existence of the bourgeoisie, but one must also know just how brutally damaging they've actually been. Thus, in the second episode, we'll be showcasing the second threat, a type of person of which the bourgeoisie is directly responsible for creating, that will demonstrate beyond any reasonable doubt the negative consequences of their insufferable greed. However, I'm gonna warn you, it's gonna be really depressing.